In just 72 hours, a black woman was publicly humiliated in a courtroom in a small southern town. The police mocked her, and the entire courtroom treated her with disdain until she pulled out a card that left everyone stunned, and an empire of power was toppled right there on the spot. But why did a Supreme Court justice quietly enter this town disguised as an anonymous figure? Brookridge, a small town nestled behind the ancient forest of the South, where the sun always shines down on tree-lined streets with a peaceful and artificial calm. At first glance, everything here exudes the charm of classic America. American flags fluttering atop wooden rooftops, the sound of church bells ringing every Sunday morning, and bakeries filling the air with the gentle scent of fresh pastries on the main street. But if you listen closely, something feels off. The wind doesn't just rustle through the trees. It whispers untold stories about fear, silence, and nods of submission. The townspeople smile as you pass by, but their eyes quietly avert, avoiding the truth that everyone knows but no one dares speak of. In the midst of this seemingly serene setting, there is one name that sends a chill through the spine of anyone who hears it: Wade Harper. A white police officer in his 40s, broad-shouldered with shaved silver hair and eyes as cold and empty as metal, he knows no sympathy. He doesn't need to shout to assert his power. A single glance is enough to make anyone take 3 steps back. Harper doesn't believe in the law, at least not for everyone. To him, justice is a privilege, a commodity that only certain people in the town are allowed to own, and he is the gatekeeper. On Brookridge's main street, as people start their ordinary morning, the camera slowly pans to Wade Harper stepping out of Harlan's diner. He chews on a half-eaten donut, a smirk curling on his lips, his other hand holding a steaming cup of black coffee. He doesn't look at anyone unless they're his friend. And if you're a person of color, like the middle-aged man quietly sweeping leaves across the street, the only glance you'll get from him is a cold, contemptuous one. "Hey you, planning to sweep all day?" Wade growls, jutting his chin in command. The man pauses, lowering his head and muttering, "I'm almost done, sir." But there's no respect in the way Wade looks back, only a quiet warning, as if he's saying, "You're lucky I don't have a reason to arrest you." No one who witnesses this speaks up. An elderly woman sitting on the park bench tries to look away, pretending to admire the birds even though her eyes have long been blurred with tears. A young boy pedals by, slowing down curiously to look at Wade, only to be yanked back by his mother in panic. In Brookridge, children learn early on what to fear, not monsters under the bed, but the man in uniform standing in broad daylight, sipping coffee like a supreme god, deciding who gets freedom, who must remain silent, and who disappears. This is not a story about a town with problems. This is a story about a town built on those very problems. Every brick on the streets, every crack in the town hall, is a mark of the persecutions that have been concealed, the pleas for help that went unheard, and the lawsuits that were never filed. Brookridge is peaceful, but it's the kind of peace you only see when you've learned not to speak. And in this stifling calm, Wade Harper isn't the biggest problem. He's the symbol of the entire system, the unmasked face of a justice rotted at its core. From a distance, a strange car is approaching the town with plates from elsewhere. No one knows who the woman behind the wheel is. No one expects that in less than 3 days, this very woman will shake Brookridge to its core. And by then, Wade Harper will no longer be the one asking the questions. He will be the one answering. The sleek black sedan glided down the narrow road, entering the town of Brookridge under the warm morning light. Inside the car, Camille Foster, a dignified black woman with smooth brown skin, sat firmly behind the wheel. She wore large sunglasses that covered most of her face, yet they couldn't conceal the confidence and grace emanating from her posture. Soft jazz melodies filled the air, creating a peaceful atmosphere that starkly contrasted what was about to unfold. Camille had no idea that at that very moment, the town was preparing to receive a shock. She wasn't in a hurry. Instead, she was savoring the tranquility of the morning and the journey through familiar streets. But as her car moved through the winding lanes of Brookridge, it felt like every pair of eyes was suddenly drawn to her. In fact, one could almost hear the whispers among the locals as they passed by. In this town, Camille was an anomaly, a stranger's face, a black woman who didn't seem to belong. Brookridge wasn't accustomed to the presence of people like her. and Camille herself never imagined she would become a part of this story, a part of the fight for justice. Before she could register the unease rising within her, her car was stopped by a patrol vehicle. Wade Harper, the only police officer in town known for his rudeness and arrogance, stepped out of the patrol car, wearing the smirk Camille couldn't miss. He walked slowly toward her car, adjusting his police hat, his stride leisurely but full of confidence, as if everything was within his control. "Good morning, ma'am," Wade said, his voice hoarse and dripping with mockery. "Did you know your taillight is out? That's why I stopped you." Camille peered at him over her sunglasses, saying nothing. She knew this was just an excuse. She had checked her tail light when she started driving, and it was working fine. But this was Brookridge, and here, sometimes a small flaw could serve as an excuse to interrogate an outsider, especially if that outsider had skin that didn't belong. "Maybe I didn't see it clearly," Camille said, her voice calm yet sharp. "But I believe the light is still functioning just fine." Wade sneered, unsurprised by her response. "Oh sure. You think you can drive into this town without anyone noticing? This town's not for people like you, girl." From Wade's tone, Camille could feel the blatant contempt and racism. His words weren't just casual ridicule. They were commands, a way of asserting that she, with her skin color, didn't have the right to enter this space freely. His words were those of someone with power, someone who believed they had the right to judge and control others simply because they didn't belong to the community he thought he represented. Camille sighed, gently rolling down the window just enough for him to hear her voice clearly. "I don't understand what you mean, but I'm just passing through. There's nothing wrong." Wade stood tall, his eyes gleaming as if waiting for an angry response from her. But Camille was unlike anyone he had faced before. She didn't shout. She didn't tremble. She refused to be subdued by his petty cruelty and prejudice. "You'll need to step out of the car and provide your documents," Wade ordered, his voice unchanged. Camille knew that no matter what she did, he wouldn't stop causing trouble. She sighed softly, regaining her composure. "All right," Camille said. "You need my documents, I'll give them to you. But I expect you not to forget that I have the right to know why I was stopped without a legitimate reason." Camille extended her hand slowly, taking the ticket Wade handed her, but she didn't rush to sign it. Her fingers grazed the paper, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not just an arbitrary fine, but an act of power, a tool of oppression. She knew the law, she knew her rights, and above all, she knew the feeling of being dismissed and humiliated simply for being who she was. But she wasn't going to let this moment slip away without ensuring that she wasn't being treated unfairly, not for vague reasons, not for something as meaningless as a broken light that wasn't even broken. Her eyes narrowed, and as she examined the ticket, she took the time to consider every single word, every tiny detail. Her heart raced, but her face remained composed, the mark of someone who had faced worse before and was ready to face it again. She would not bend today. But Camille's calmness only infuriated Wade even more. He was used to people being intimidated, used to seeing fear when he spoke, used to seeing people back down. But Camille didn't react the way the others did. She didn't flinch, she didn't stumble over her words, and that was a challenge he could not ignore. The power he so comfortably wielded was slipping through his fingers, and it made him feel small. Rage built within him, a storm of anger that had no place to go. He watched her for a moment longer, his fists tightening, and then, without warning, he jerked the ticket from her hands, his grip rough and violent. "What do you think you're doing?" Wade barked, his voice low but laced with venom, his eyes now blazing with contempt. "Who do you think you are, trying to tell me how to do my job? You're not even from here, and you think you can just waltz in, question me like some kind of expert?" His voice rose, no longer controlled, a dangerous undercurrent running through his words. Camille stood there, holding his stare, but her heart thudded in her chest. She could feel the heat of his anger, the weight of his hatred, but she wasn't going to let him see her falter. She had seen this kind of aggression before. Men like him, full of self-righteous power, always use threats and intimidation to make themselves feel superior. But Camille wasn't like the others. She had lived through enough to understand that silence in the face of injustice only gave it more power. She wasn't going to let him take that power away from her. Her voice was steady, despite the storm brewing in Wade's eyes. "I'm not trying to teach you anything, officer," she said, her words sharp but calm. "But I do know my rights, and I will not be intimidated into signing something that's not correct. You stopped me for no reason, and I have every right to ask why." Wade's lips curled into a sneer, the kind of smile that was both mocking and dangerous. "Rights? You're in Brookridge now, girl. Out here, your rights don't mean a damn thing. And neither does your little attitude." He took a step closer, his presence imposing, his body blocking the sun from her view. He stood so close, she could smell the faint scent of tobacco on his uniform. "You think you can come here, tell me how to do my job, and walk away like nothing's wrong? You're not even supposed to be here. This town doesn't belong to people like you." His words stung more than any slap could have, more than any insult could ever have. But Camille didn't let herself react. She had seen too many people fall into the trap of responding out of anger, out of hurt, only to be punished for it. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. Wade's fury was bubbling over now. He wasn't used to being challenged. No one in this town dared challenge him. He was the law, and if anyone tried to defy him, he would make them pay. The sense of superiority he carried with him made him feel invincible. He would show Camille that no one defied him and got away with it. "You think you're above the law? You think you can just drive into my town and treat me like I'm some kind of fool?" His words were spat out, venomous and malicious. "You're under arrest for resisting a police officer." His voice rang out, loud and commanding, like a judge delivering a sentence. Camille could feel the weight of the words pressing down on her, the injustice of them stifling the breath from her chest. She stood frozen for a moment, the shock of what was happening hitting her with a force she hadn't expected. She had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the gut-wrenching reality of it. The silence around them deepened, thickening the air with tension. People on the street stopped in their tracks, staring at the scene unfolding before them. But no one spoke up, no one moved. In Brookridge, you didn't challenge the status quo, you didn't fight back. Camille stood there, still clutching the ticket in her hand, her fingers trembling, but her face was a mask of defiance. She could feel the bile of anger rising in her throat, but she refused to let it spill out. She would not give Wade the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She would not give him the power he so desperately sought. "You can't do this," Camille said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried with the weight of truth. "This is wrong." Wade ignored her, the handcuffs already clicking shut with a cold finality. The sound of the metal locking into place was a cruel reminder of the system that had already condemned her. The cold steel wrapped around her wrists, a symbol of everything that was wrong with this town. But Camille wasn't broken. She wouldn't let herself be. As Wade led her toward the patrol car, Camille's heart pounded in her chest. But deep down, she knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning. Wade Harper, with all his arrogance and power, had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had underestimated her, and when she finally got her chance, when she stood in front of the world, she would make sure everyone knew that the truth would never be silenced. The courtroom in Brookridge was not a place where justice was served, but rather a stage for injustice. The crowd sat silently in the pews, the dim light casting a cold glow on each face. The atmosphere in the room was thick, suffocating, without excitement, without noise, only the scrutinizing gazes, the soft whispers, and the stifling tension that you could almost touch. Wade Harper, the police officer Camille had encountered earlier that day, stood smugly at the front, his face filled with self-satisfaction. He didn't need to say much. His arrogant posture, the gleaming police hat, and the way he stood there like a god in this space all spoke volumes about his power. People like Wade didn't need to speak. They only had to stand there, and everything became theirs by default. To Wade, justice was something he owned, something he could control however he wished, regardless of the truth. Camille sat alone at the lawyer's table, her gaze distant, fixed on nothing in particular. She didn't feel any support from the people sitting in that room. A sense of isolation swelled within her. She could see the eyes of the crowd on her, but not a single one of them showed any empathy or support. She was an outsider, someone with no right to be part of this fight, at least in the eyes of those in power. As Wade stood there, Camille felt the entire courtroom closing in around her. He stood like a victor, and she, just a casualty pushed into the shadows of a system that offered her no protection, no advocate. His words weren't just statements. They were assertions of the power he wielded. A police officer filled with arrogance and hostility toward anyone who didn't belong to his community had already defeated Camille the moment she walked into that courtroom. In Brookridge, justice belongs to the strong. That declaration wasn't just a verdict. It was a truth that had been confirmed long ago. Justice was not something available to everyone. Justice in Brookridge was reserved for those with power, people like Wade, people who knew how to manipulate everything to their advantage, from the decisions in the courtroom to the lives destroyed outside of it. And Camille, a black woman and outsider to this system, had become the outcast, placed in the role of injustice. Camille could not accept this. The feeling of outrage blazed within her like an uncontrollable fire. She had endured too much injustice in her life to stand still and accept it now. But what enraged her even more wasn't just Wade's judgment. It was the way the system had been designed to protect him and people like him. This wasn't a personal battle between Camille and Wade. This was a fight against a system that was rotten to the core, a system where justice and power were never equally distributed. In the courtroom, every eye seemed to be focused on Camille, but she refused to let herself appear weak. She wouldn't let this injustice snuff out her hope. She knew that no matter how hard this system tried, she would not succumb. She would fight, and she would not let this wrongful judgment continue. Wade stepped up to the witness stand, his face stretching into a smug grin. He stood there as though he had complete control over everything in that courtroom. He began to recount his version of the story, weaving a tale filled with lies, doing so without a trace of shame. She was aggressive, yelling at me in front of everyone, Wade declared, his voice echoing across the room as if it were an undeniable truth. He made a dismissive motion with his hand, his eyes sweeping over Camille with a look of contempt. People like her don't deserve respect. As Wade's words hung in the air, the courtroom seemed to freeze. Camille could feel the eyes of everyone in the room drilling into her, each glance like a sharp knife slicing through her soul. No one believed her. They only believed Wade, the police officer cloaked in the shield of power and unspoken protection. And Camille, the black woman, was merely a powerless pawn in his twisted narrative. But Camille refused to let herself be weak. Even though her eyes burned with fury, she remained silent. She bit down on her lip, forcing herself to hold back the words that threatened to spill out, but the pain inside her only deepened. Every word Wade spoke felt like a blow to her dignity, to her honor. She wasn't aggressive. She was simply asking for fairness, for the respect that everyone, regardless of skin color or status, had a right to receive. She didn't respond to Wade, not because of the insults, but because she understood that in this courtroom, every word she said would be twisted, distorted, bent to fit the narrative they wanted to push. But even in her silence, Camille felt a strong urge rising within her. She knew that her silence wasn't submission. It was a powerful statement. No matter how hard Wade tried to fabricate the truth, no matter how much the system wanted to conceal it, the truth would eventually prevail. The courtroom grew heavy, the air thickening, each sound pressing down on Camille like a weight on her chest. Judge Lewis, who had seemed stern and impartial when he first entered, now sat there nodding along with Wade without a hint of skepticism or the need for any evidence. Just one subtle nod from the judge, and Wade, the arrogant police officer, received unconditional protection. All Camille could do was look at the judge, the very person she had trusted to deliver a fair verdict, now aligned with the one who had distorted the truth. It seems everything is quite clear now, Judge Lewis spoke, his voice even, though it couldn't hide the bias. Wade is an experienced officer, and there's no reason not to believe his testimony. Those words hit Camille like a slap in the face. Everything had been decided before it even started, she realized. No matter how much truth, how much evidence, it was meaningless in a courtroom already manipulated. This judge, the one who should have stood to protect justice, was now nothing more than an old friend of Wade's, blinded by friendship and personal gain. In a surge of anger and despair, Camille stood up, a steely determination flashing in her eyes. She could no longer stand still. Her voice, though calm, carried an undeniable inner strength with every word that cut through the tense silence in the room. "I'm simply asking for my basic rights," Camille said, her voice unwavering, each word cutting through the air like a sharp knife. She was no longer afraid. She had grown tired of the accusations and the injustice. It was time for her to stand up. But Judge Lewis wouldn't give her the chance. He interrupted immediately, his face cold and emotionless. "Silence," he commanded, his voice as hard as steel. "If you don't, I'll have you jailed immediately." Camille paused, her lips trembling, but her gaze never left the judge. In that moment, she felt a wave of paralysis, the crushing weight of helplessness taking over. Every word she spoke, every attempt to defend herself, was immediately smothered. She stood there, trapped by the very system she had believed in, feeling like a caged animal unable to escape. In that instant, everyone in the courtroom could feel Camille's helplessness. It wasn't just her. It was as if they too were being suffocated by the same laws, the same unspoken pressures. The eyes around her, the faces filled with embarrassment and fear, as if they understood that they too were living in a system where justice wasn't for everyone, only silence and acceptance of fate. It was in that moment that Camille realized her fight was not just against Wade. It was against a system that had rotted from the inside out. And in that moment, her faith in justice began to waver. Camille sat silently in the cold, dimly lit cell, her body exhausted but her mind racing uncontrollably. The room was dark, the faint light from the small window casting shadows across her face, creating a vague, eerie darkness that seemed to suffocate the space. Everything around her felt oppressive, as if the very air in this room was thick with stagnation. She couldn't see anyone but herself. The walls, the cold bars, were all just reflections of a system she had once believed would protect justice. But now, that same system was the one holding her captive. A quiet sigh escaped Camille, breaking the silence of the cell. It was a soft sound, but it felt heavy, a silent admission of the exhaustion and the growing sense of despair inside her. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything other than the events that had just unfolded. Being imprisoned in this cell, Camille wasn't just deprived of her freedom. She was stripped of her ability to fight for justice. She had fought with all her might, but now all she could do was sit there in the silence, facing her own helplessness. This feeling, this pain, wasn't physical. It was a deep, searing ache in her soul, a humiliation at realizing that all she had hoped for, ideals of justice, of a fair world, now seemed like nothing but empty words. Camille wasn't just imprisoned by bars. She was imprisoned by the injustice of a system she had trusted. It was a silent pain, one that couldn't be expressed, one that couldn't be shared with anyone. She was locked away in a society she had devoted her life to, only to be met with betrayal. Quietly, Camille gazed through the sliver of a window. Outside, she could only see darkness, the blurry shapes of life beyond her reach. But even if there were light, even if there were freedom out there, all she felt inside was despair. She couldn't find an escape, couldn't see a flicker of hope. This system had dealt her a crippling blow, and no matter how hard she tried, she was trapped within barriers she could never break through. Camille sat quietly in her cell, the faint light barely enough to dispel the darkness clouding her mind. But in a fleeting moment, an image from the past suddenly appeared in her memory. It was the grandeur of the courtroom in Washington, D.C., a place where she had once stood as a Supreme Court justice. The bright light from the towering windows streamed down, reflecting off her elegant black robes, the uniform of one who had held the immense responsibility of protecting justice for the entire nation. The black leather chairs, the strong, solid columns, all surrounded Camille like a monument, a place where every word she uttered was heard and respected. She was not just an ordinary woman. She was a symbol, a woman revered by the entire country. But now, Camille was no longer the Supreme Court justice. She was no longer the guardian of the law, no longer someone with the power to fight for the truth. She was simply Camille Hayes, an anonymous name, rejected and trampled upon. That name now held no meaning beyond shame, no value in a world that had turned its back on her. As she remembered those days, Camille had once stood in that grand courtroom, gazing at the crowd, feeling the respect, the anticipation in the air. She knew that justice would always be upheld, at least within the bounds of what she could control. But now, looking back at those days, she realized everything had changed. She had been buried by the very system she had once trusted, left behind in the cold bars of a small courtroom where all her hopes had shattered. A wave of despair surged again in Camille's heart. She had once stood at the pinnacle, but now she lay at the bottom of a deep abyss of destruction. Her identity had been buried under the weight of the accusations, beneath the raging waves of injustice that Wade and people like him had created. And in this moment, Camille was no longer the woman of justice. She was merely someone discarded, a name that had lost everything she had once fought for. After being released, Camille returned to her place of rest, but the sense of peace she had once found there was gone. The small room she stayed in no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become an invisible prison. The walls around her seemed to weigh down on her, and the oppressive atmosphere repeated the pain she was facing. Though no longer in a cell, the loneliness and pressure still clung to her. The feeling of being trapped in injustice made Camille's heart grow heavier. As night fell, Camille couldn't sleep. Her sighs echoed in the quiet room as all the anger and despair flooded back into her mind. Outside the window, the sounds of the town grew closer. The murmurs of the people reached her ears, and they were no longer soft whispers. They had turned into insults, even curses. She brought this upon herself. Camille heard one of the voices in the crowd say. The words cut through her heart like a knife. Camille could feel the distinct rejection in the eyes of the townspeople. No one supported her anymore. They didn't just turn their backs on her. They saw her as an enemy. She had fought for justice, but now she had become the target of their scorn. The town she had once thought of as home had now become a foreign place, a place where every step she took was filled with hostility. But that night, the loneliness didn't just come from the words of the crowd. Suddenly, a loud noise rang out from outside. A stone shattered against the window. Camille jumped to her feet, her eyes wide with panic. Before she could comprehend what had happened, another stone flew through the air, shattering the window into pieces. The deafening crash of the stones against the glass shattered like the fragments of the hopes she once had. The people here weren't just turning their backs on her. They had truly humiliated her, leaving her unable to find peace even for a fleeting moment. This act of vengeance was something Camille hadn't anticipated. Each stone was like a stab at her dignity. They wanted her to understand that she no longer had a place here. The feeling of isolation, the hostility, didn't only come from strangers. The people who she thought would stand by her now were the very ones pushing her into complete isolation. They hadn't just betrayed her legally. They were now ostracizing her within this very community. There was nowhere left to seek solace, no one left to lean on. But in that silent pain, Camille realized that no matter how much they tried to make her bow her head, she would never yield. She knew that her fight was far from over. No matter how much this town turned against her, she still had the right to stand up and keep fighting. And this time, Camille wouldn't just fight for herself. She would fight for all those who had been abandoned by the system. After a long night filled with anxiety and isolation, Camille remained sitting in her small room, where the echoes of stones being thrown and the insults still lingered in her mind. Yet within her, there was still a faint flicker of hope, a small light she had never wished to abandon. But she knew that alone, she couldn't fight forever. She needed a friend, an ally, someone who could help her take on this system. And then, just when she thought she had lost everything, a soft knock on the door broke through the silence. Reverend Samuel Cross, a black pastor from the town, entered with a calm demeanor, yet a firm determination in his steps. As he looked at Camille, his eyes held understanding and, above all, empathy. He was the only one who didn't see Camille as an outsider, but as a friend, a fellow warrior in need of help. "I saw you at the trial," Reverend Cross began, his voice warm yet strong. "You are not alone." His words hit Camille like a breath of fresh air, soothing the tension in her heart and opening up a new glimmer of hope. Yes, she was not alone. There were others out there, small and silent as they may be, who were still willing to stand with the truth, with justice. The two sat in a small church just outside the town. The atmosphere was calm and sacred. The light from the stained glass windows poured through, casting vibrant streaks of color across the room, as if the very light was guiding them. It was a space where Camille felt comfort and understanding, where all the darkness in her heart seemed to dissipate. Reverend Cross looked into Camille's eyes, his gaze filled with determination. "Camille," he said, "I know you've been fighting alone for a long time. But remember, justice is not always easily attained, and it certainly doesn't come from just you. You need to stand with others, those who are willing to fight beside you." His words were like magic. In that moment, when Camille felt as though she had been cast aside from the world, she knew her fight couldn't just be a personal battle. Justice wasn't something that could be won alone. But there were people like Reverend Cross who understood that Camille couldn't do it by herself, and that only when everyone stands together can real change begin. With that encouragement, Camille began to feel her strength return. She no longer fought alone. She had the strength of others, like Reverend Cross, who were ready to help her on this journey. And above all, she knew that light would always exist, even in the darkest of times. After the hopeful meeting with Reverend Samuel Cross in the small church, Camille no longer felt alone in her fight. Reverend Cross had shown her that to confront a system filled with injustice, she couldn't rely solely on her own strength. She needed to build a team, a network of people willing to stand for justice. And that's why her encounter with Tasha Fields and Damon Walker became the next turning point in Camille's journey. As Camille sat across from Tasha and Damon, she saw in their eyes the same determination she needed to rediscover within herself. Tasha, with tears that hadn't quite dried, recounted her painful story of being stopped by Wade for no apparent reason, then forced to sign a ticket for something she hadn't even done. Worse, the mocking words from him made her feel like an outsider, excluded from a community she once thought could offer respect to everyone. "He told me I didn't belong here." Damon Walker, a young black man, had also fallen victim to the hate Wade had sowed. He recounted a brutal beating he received over a trivial argument. They didn't beat him because he was wrong. They beat him because he was black, and that was the only reason Wade needed. "They didn't hit me for what I said. They hit me because I'm black." The stories Tasha and Damon shared, each detail about the abuse of power and Wade's cruelty, made Camille realize that his actions weren't just personal brutality, but a part of a larger system of racism and power. They were victims of brutality, but now they had become Camille's allies in this legal battle. As she listened, Camille took out her notebook, jotting down every word, every key detail. Her eyes lit up with resolve. This wasn't just about confronting a bad man. This was a fight against an entire system, with Wade being just a small manifestation of it. What she was gathering from this meeting would become a powerful weapon to fight for justice, to overthrow those who had created the injustice and suffering for innocent people. Not just the testimonies of Tasha and Damon, but Camille understood that the very testimonies and connections she was forging with allies like Reverend Cross would help her build an unshakable strategy. It was silent resistance, but a resistance that would grow stronger with every step. Camille knew she was getting closer to the day when Wade could no longer escape the consequences of his crimes. As Camille sat quietly in her small room, grappling with the new reality of her situation, there was a sense of peace that slowly began to return, like a delicate thread weaving through the dark fabric of her despair. The battles ahead were far from over, but for the first time in what felt like ages, a flicker of hope stirred within her. She had been fighting alone for so long against not only the corruption and oppression of people like Wade, but also the system that had allowed them to thrive. Now, the weight of the isolation seemed a little lighter. And just as she started to believe in the possibility of a turning tide, a soft knock on her door broke the stillness. When Camille opened the door, she was met by the determined, fiery presence of Lauren Kim, a young attorney who exuded a sense of passion and resolve that was impossible to ignore. Lauren had heard of Camille's struggles from Reverend Cross and other supporters in the town, and the injustice of the situation had moved her deeply. She could no longer sit idle. This was her moment to act. "I've been following your case," Lauren said, her voice steady and unwavering, carrying the weight of someone who had already made up her mind. "And I'm going to help you. We're going to make them pay." The words hit Camille like a breath of fresh air, like a small light breaking through the suffocating darkness she had been trapped in. Camille's heart lifted. The oppressive weight of her solitude lessened. For the first time in a long while, Camille felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of this battle on her own shoulders. There was someone else now, someone with the knowledge and commitment to stand beside her. Looking into Lauren's eyes, Camille saw the same fierce determination that had been ignited within her during her darkest moments. This was no longer just Camille's fight. With Lauren's unwavering support, it was a shared cause. Camille now had an ally who was just as ready to fight for justice as she was, someone who believed in the cause, in the power of standing together, and in the possibility of making things right. I'm here to fight alongside you, Lauren continued, her voice full of conviction. This isn't just about one man. It's about an entire system of corruption, and we can bring it down. The gravity of Lauren's words settled in Camille's chest, filling her with a renewed sense of hope. This was no longer about a lone woman taking on the world. With Lauren's help, Camille now had the foundation of a team, a group of like-minded individuals who would stand together in the fight for justice. This was a turning point. It wasn't just a battle against Wade Harper or the abuses he had inflicted. It was a battle against the entire system that had nurtured and protected people like him. Wade was just one piece in the puzzle of systemic injustice. But now Camille had the strength and determination of someone who wasn't going to back down. They sat down together, and from the first exchange of ideas, strategies began to take shape. Camille had always known that a solitary battle wouldn't win the war. Her individual fight could only go so far, but with the right people by her side, she could begin to dismantle the system that had failed so many. She wasn't just fighting to win a case against one corrupt cop. They were going to expose an entire network of deceit and corruption, starting with Wade, but ultimately toppling the structures that enabled this kind of abuse to thrive. As the conversation continued, Camille felt the power of their alliance growing stronger. This was no longer a quiet, solitary protest against the injustices she had faced. It was a movement. Camille and Lauren together would make sure their voices were heard. Their combined strength, from Lauren's legal expertise to Camille's unyielding resolve, was a force to be reckoned with. The alliance of justice between Camille and Lauren was officially forged that day. It wasn't just a partnership. It was a symbol of hope for those who had been silenced, of resistance against the forces that sought to maintain their power through fear and oppression. Camille knew deep in her soul that with the help of Lauren and the support of the people who believed in her, this was the beginning of a fight that would no longer be fought in the shadows. They would stand together, and justice would not be ignored. As they finalized their strategy and made their plans, Camille knew that she was no longer standing alone. She had the backing of people who had lived through injustice and who were ready to see it corrected. This wasn't just her personal battle anymore. This was the battle of every voice that had been silenced, every injustice that had been allowed to persist. Camille now had an unbreakable alliance, a team that would help her take down the corrupt system from within. And with this new strength, Camille knew that the day when Wade Harper would face the consequences of his actions was coming. The wheels of justice had started to turn, and they would not stop until truth prevailed. The day of the trial had come again, and Wade Harper walked into the courtroom with a face full of arrogance and self-satisfaction. He stood at the front, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto Camille, who was sitting across from him, her gaze unwavering. Wade was used to manipulating the system, turning innocent people into criminals simply because they dared stand against him. He had never considered Camille to be a real threat, someone who could shake his position. He believed he could still win, that nothing this time would strip him of his control. With a smirk on his lips, Wade stepped up to the witness stand, his voice booming across the courtroom. "She's a liar, a rat who dared to defy me," he sneered, unable to hold back the arrogance in his voice. He was convinced, once again, that justice would tip in his favor, that all of Camille's efforts would be nothing more than a trivial matter of no consequence in the eyes of the court. As he finished speaking, a heavy silence enveloped the courtroom. But then, the eyes of everyone turned to Camille. She sat still, an indescribable calm radiating from her. Wade's insults did not shake her. On the contrary, Camille smiled softly, an enigmatic smile that no one could quite understand. It wasn't a smile of submission. It was a smile of confidence, of preparation for something Wade could never foresee. In that moment, a wave of tension rose in the courtroom. All eyes were on Camille, not because of weakness, but because of the unbreakable resolve within her. She knew that Wade's words were nothing but desperate resistance from a man who knew he was losing his power. She smiled because she understood exactly what was coming next. The truth had already been revealed, and Wade no longer had a place to hide. The audience in the room could no longer remain still, their hearts pounding. Those who had followed this story from the beginning, who had witnessed Camille's struggles day by day, now felt the shift, the coming reckoning. Camille didn't need to say anything more. That mysterious smile had said it all. he would pay for his crimes. The courtroom fell silent, and all eyes turned to Camille as she stood up. At that moment, Camille didn't need to say much. She had prepared for this confrontation long enough to face Wade's arrogance, the man who had thought for so long that he could manipulate everything around him. She was no longer a victim of injustice. She was now the one ready to strike back, to bring the truth into the light. Her voice rang out, strong and confident. "I'm not a rat. I am a Supreme Court Justice of the United States." Those words were not just a declaration of who Camille was, but a challenge that could not be denied, aimed directly at Wade and anyone who had underestimated her. It was a statement that the injustice Wade had inflicted could not continue. Camille reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her Associate Justice badge, holding it high before the court. The badge was a symbol of power and justice, a living testament to everything she had done, to everything she had fought to achieve. The badge gleamed brightly under the courtroom lights, reflecting an undeniable truth. Wade stood there, his eyes wide, unable to believe what he had just heard. He, a man who had once been so self-assured in his power, was now facing a truth he could no longer hide. He stared at Camille, at the badge in her hand, and all the confidence he had built over the years suddenly crumbled before him. The courtroom was completely still, and everyone understood that the wall Wade had built over the years had started to crack. Camille didn't need to say anything more. She had shown that she was not a rat, but a woman of immense power, resistance, and one who would not let anyone look down on her. Wade stood completely still, his eyes locked onto the badge Camille had just raised, unable to process what he was seeing. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, it seemed as though the room itself had stopped moving. The truth struck him with the force of a wave crashing against a shore, relentless and inescapable. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He tried to speak, but the weight of Camille's revelation had left him paralyzed, unable to form a coherent sentence. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, the cold trickle running down his face, and his body trembled as though the ground beneath him had suddenly turned to quicksand. For years, Wade had believed himself untouchable. He had reveled in the power he wielded, the fear he instilled in others. He had become so accustomed to controlling the lives of those around him that the idea of anyone standing up to him had seemed laughable. But now, with Camille standing before him, unwavering and resolute, all of that control seemed to slip away in an instant. The foundation of his arrogance was crumbling, and in its place was an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. His legs buckled beneath him, and he stumbled, collapsing into the chair behind him with a loud thud. His face turned a sickly shade of pale, his eyes wide with disbelief and panic. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. How had he let this happen? He had always been so careful, so meticulous in his manipulation of the system. But now, in the blink of an eye, everything he had worked for was unraveling. His reputation, his career, his life as he knew it. It was all slipping through his fingers, and he could do nothing to stop it. The local judge, Wade's longtime ally and friend, stood at the back of the courtroom, frozen in shock. His mouth opened as though he were about to speak, but no words came out. His face had gone ashen, and his eyes flicked nervously between Wade and Camille, as if searching for some way to undo the damage that had been done. But there was no escaping the truth. Wade had been exposed, and there was nothing anyone could do to shield him anymore. The truth, no matter how much they tried to hide it, had emerged, and now the world would see it for what it truly was. Wade's once confident and unshakable composure had been shattered. His every move, every word he had carefully crafted, now seemed meaningless. Camille's calm smile, her quiet strength, had dismantled everything he had built. The empire of lies and corruption he had surrounded himself with had crumbled in a single moment, and the realization was too much for him to bear. The room was silent, save for the soft shuffling of the audience as they took in what had just transpired. The very air in the courtroom seemed charged, heavy with the gravity of the moment. Wade's panic was palpable, and for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be truly powerless. He had built his empire on fear and intimidation, and now it was all falling apart in front of him. As Camille stood there, unflinching, a sense of justice washed over the courtroom. Wade had been exposed for the fraud he was, and Camille's unwavering composure had shown everyone present what true strength looked like. There was no room for doubt anymore. The system that had allowed Wade to thrive was now beginning to crack, and Camille was at the forefront of that change. Wade, now completely broken, couldn't look anyone in the eye. His arrogance had turned into sheer panic, and he knew deep down that this was the beginning of the end for him. The walls he had so carefully constructed around himself had fallen, and the cold, unforgiving truth had come to light. Camille's smile was not one of triumph, but of quiet certainty. She had already won. Wade had already lost. The courtroom was deathly quiet as Camille stood with her head held high, her eyes unwavering. Every person in the room felt the weight of her presence. The silence grew heavy with anticipation as she spoke the words that would change everything. I have contacted the Department of Justice. Brookridge will answer for what it has done. Camille's voice rang out, each syllable carrying the force of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Wade, the man who had controlled the town for so long, was no longer the one in control. The change that had been building slowly but surely had now reached its peak. As her words settled into the room, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Federal police cars appeared, rolling into Brookridge with an unmistakable sense of authority. The arrival of the feds signified the beginning of the end for Wade. His grip on the town, on the power he had abused for so many years, was about to be shattered. Camille watched as Wade, who once believed he was invincible, stood frozen, his face contorted with disbelief. In that moment, the walls he had built around himself began to crumble. Wade tried to maintain his composure, but it was futile. The federal agents marched into the courtroom, their presence undeniable. Before long, Wade was handcuffed, his screams of outrage echoing through the space as he was escorted from the courtroom. The sound of his voice, once filled with arrogance and control, now reeked of desperation. The townspeople who had witnessed his reign of terror for years watched in stunned silence as the man who had tormented them for so long was brought low. The entire town of Brookridge could feel the seismic shift in the air. Wade had been the embodiment of unchecked power for so long. He had been the face of authority, and now, in one swift motion, he had been stripped of it. Camille had done what no one had ever thought possible. She had brought justice to a town that had been suffocated by corruption and fear. As Wade was led away, Tasha Fields and Damon Walker finally stood up, no longer silent victims. They were no longer afraid, no longer resigned to the injustice that had been forced upon them for so long. They were ready to face the truth, to stand in front of the very system that had tried to crush them and demand accountability. Tasha, her eyes swollen from crying but no longer filled with fear, stepped forward and recounted her own story. Each word she spoke was filled with pain, but also with a newfound strength. "He told me I didn't belong here," she said, the weight of the words carrying more than just her personal suffering. It was a cry for all those who had been marginalized, for all those who had been told they were less than. Her voice wavered, but there was no mistaking the fire that burned within her. Tasha had not just suffered at Wade's hands. She had been made to feel as though she didn't deserve to exist in the very town she called home. But now, she was reclaiming her voice. Damon too stepped forward, his voice steady and resolute. He recounted the brutal assault he had endured, not for anything he had done wrong, but simply because of his race. "They didn't hit me because of what I said," Damon said, his words cutting through the courtroom like a sharp blade. "They hit me because I'm black." And that was all the reason Wade needed. The truth was now out in the open, the cruelty and the hatred of Wade's actions no longer hidden behind the veil of authority. As Tasha and Damon spoke, the courtroom began to stir. The audience, once passive, was now visibly moved. People began to clap, slowly at first, but then with increasing intensity. The applause was not just for Tasha and Damon's courage, but for the collective strength that was finally being realized. The town, which had been under the oppressive grip of fear and silence, was beginning to come alive with the power of truth. Camille stood in the background, watching, her heart swelling with pride. She had known all along that this moment would come, that the truth would be revealed, and the people would no longer remain silent. The tears that fell from the eyes of Tasha and Damon were not just tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of catharsis, of a weight finally being lifted from their shoulders. They had been oppressed for so long, forced into submission by a system that had written them off as less than. But now, they were reclaiming their dignity, their power, their truth. Camille had been the catalyst for this change, the light that had shown the way out of the darkness. As the court session continued and the evidence was presented, it became undeniable that Wade's actions could no longer be hidden. The local judge, who had once been Wade's ally, stood in silence. His face was pale, his eyes flicking nervously between Wade and Camille. He could no longer pretend that he didn't see the truth. Camille, standing with grace and determination, had proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that Wade was guilty. The system, for so long a shield for the corrupt, was now beginning to fracture. Camille had pierced that shield with precision, and now there was no turning back. The judge, his voice no longer steady, pronounced Wade's sentence. He would serve time in prison, and the entire police department would be under investigation. Wade, who had once been untouchable, was now a man with no escape. The walls he had built were shattered, and the truth had swept through them like a flood. His reign of terror had ended, and for the first time, the people of Brookridge could see the light at the end of the tunnel. When the final verdict was announced, a wave of satisfaction washed over Camille. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been wronged by the system, for everyone who had been silenced, oppressed, and ignored. She had fought not only for herself, but for all the Tashas, the Damons, and the countless others who had been crushed by the weight of injustice. Justice had finally been served. Wade would pay for his crimes, and Brookridge would never be the same. The story of Camille was no longer just the story of one woman's battle for justice. It was the story of a community, a town, and a people rising up against the forces that sought to keep them down. Camille had fought with every ounce of her strength, and in the end, she had brought about the change that was so desperately needed. The road to justice was long and painful, but Camille had shown that with courage and determination, no one could stand against the truth forever. Camille stood by the car, preparing to leave Brookridge. While she had triumphed in the legal battle, a sense of calm enveloped her. The townspeople stood along both sides of the road, clapping silently, without any fanfare or grand displays. Only a quiet respect and recognition for what Camille had done. They knew that justice wasn't just a court ruling. It was a long journey of struggle and sacrifice. She had shown them that in a world full of wrongdoing, one action could change an entire community. As Camille climbed into the car, she turned to look back at the people she had fought for. A soft smile appeared on her lips, not a smile of glorious victory, but one of satisfaction, knowing that justice had been served. Titles don't make justice. It's actions that create justice, Camille said, her words resonating in the air, a powerful message for everyone who believed that one person could change the world through their actions. Soon after Camille's departure, Brookridge seemed to undergo a transformation. The street, once silent, filled with fear and injustice, was now alive with the sound of children playing. The old houses, which once held an air of gloom, now exuded the atmosphere of new hope, a place where people no longer lived in fear, but where they could regain their faith in justice. A plaque was erected at the center of the town bearing the words, "Camille Foster, the one who brought light." These words were not just a tribute to an individual, but a reminder to all who witnessed Camille's story that one person's actions could change an entire community, could turn a town from one of fear into one of hope and justice. The townspeople felt a surge of emotion as they looked at the plaque. They knew that what Camille had done would forever be an inseparable part of their story. Camille's story didn't just end in Brookridge. It was a powerful message for each of us. If you want to see change, you must act. If you were Camille, what would you do to change the world? This question left a deep impression on the audience, urging them to reflect on their own lives and what they could do to bring about change and to ensure that the story of justice continues to spread. Camille's call was not just for those within the story, but for all who were watching. Join us in spreading the stories of justice. Camille wasn't just a hero in this story. She was an inspiration, someone who made each of us rethink our actions and the power we hold within ourselves. Click like and subscribe so you don't miss more powerful stories about justice, and continue to be a part of the journey to create a more just world for all.